Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Tonight we are looking at a moment in history that feels less like geopolitics and more like a tectonic shift beneath the world's feet. Witnessing is not just a diplomatic fracture, not just a regional conflict, but a geopolitical earthquake. One whose aftershocks will be felt in Moscow and across every capital that once claimed loyalty to the Kremlin. Let me say this clearly. When Russia's oldest allies begin removing the bridges, literally and politically, something extraordinary is happening. Europe's decision to cut off Moscow's remaining access roads is not just an act of policy. It is a geopolitical shock wave that reshapes the map, alliances, and exposes the deepest vulnerabilities in Russia's strategic posture. For years, the Kremlin operated with the assumption that its bridges into Europe, literal and diplomatic, were too foundational, too historically entrenched, economically significant for anyone to dismantle. But today, those bridges are closed, blocked, or outright removed. Moscow staring across a chasm it never believed would open, and the world is watching because what Europe did is not incremental. It is transformative. That signals a point of no return. This shift didn't happen overnight. European nations have been tightening restrictions, closing airspace, transport, and shutting down trade arteries step by step. But the final break, the moment the last bridge was cut, was executed with stunning unity. Nations that once disagreed on Russia now stood perfectly aligned. The continent had collectively decided that Moscow's behavior left them with no other choice, and that is the hook here. Europe didn't simply close passages. It sent a message that resonates from Brussels to Moscow. The era of giving Russia the benefit of the doubt is over. Even more powerful is the symbolism embedded within the action. Bridges represent trust, connection, cooperation. A nation maintains bridges with another power. It signals a willingness to engage even under strain, even during conflict. Of those bridges is the diplomatic equivalent of saying we are done. You are on your own now. That is why Moscow's panic is palpable. It's not just that Europe shut things, Europe closes bridges, Moscow isolated down. It's that Europe did it unanimously, decisively, and without hesitation. Russia expected sanctions. It expected criticism. It expected diplomatic pressure. But it never expected the continent to sever the last physical ties that allowed Moscow to feel it still had a foothold in Europe. Strategic consequences are enormous. Without access routes, Russia loses not only mobility, but influence. Its ability to move resources, negotiate passage, maintain basic logistics becomes severely impaired. The Kremlin loses leverage. It loses bargaining chips. It loses the illusion that how intense the conflict becomes, Europe will keep at least one channel open. The reality now is stark. Those channels no longer exist. Start multiplying here because every action Europe takes forces Moscow to confront the truth it has been avoiding. Its power is shrinking, are evaporating, and its sphere of influence is collapsing faster than anyone predicted. Destabilizing for Russia is what this signals to the nations still on the fence. Hesitant to break ties with Moscow, now see a united European front, and understand that the cost of standing with Russia outweighs the benefits. Entire continent says we're closing the door. It creates a domino effect. Neutral states lean west. Former partners reconsider their loyalties, finds itself more isolated than at any point in the past 40 years. Russia's leadership views Europe's move not just as a logistical nightmare, but as a political defeat. The Kremlin knows that once a bridge is destroyed literally or diplomatically, it cannot be rebuilt easily. Trust once broken becomes a relic. Influence lost becomes nearly impossible to regain. Europe's decision has carved a deep line in history, and Moscow is now standing on the wrong side of it. The world can see it. and Russia, for the first time in decades, must face a terrifying reality. The bridges that once connected it to the West are not simply closed. They are gone, and nothing about this moment can be undone. Former Soviet allies publicly broke from Russia. The geopolitical landscape shifted in a way that even the Kremlin did not anticipate. Countries bound to Moscow, not only by treaties or economics, but by decades of shared history. Nations once considered the most predictable, most influenced by Russian power, and yet many of these states have now made a stunning, unmistakable move. They have stepped away, spoken out, aligned themselves with forces that directly oppose Russia's current direction. That is not a small change, it is a generational rupture. Here is this. When the allies you built an empire with start walking away, the empire itself begins to crack. For years, under the assumption that proximity meant loyalty, many of these former Soviet republics were seen as extensions of Moscow's influence. Kremlin narratives still held weight, and Russian leverage was considered unshakable. But the events unfolding today prove something far more dramatic. Loyalty built on fear collapses the moment strength begins to fade. These nations are not merely drifting from Russia. They are openly breaking ranks, shewing public statements, voting against Moscow in global forums, restricting Russian movements, and in some cases siding with institutions designed to counter Russian power. This is not quiet distance, it is visible, undeniable separation, and each announcement, policy, each diplomatic shift becomes another blow to the Kremlin's image of regional dominance. What makes this even more significant is that these countries understand Moscow better than anyone else. They were shaped by its policies. Their political structures, languages, economic behaviors, and even national identities carry traces of the Soviet era when they make a move of this magnitude. It is not impulsive. It is strategic, and it sends a message to the world that cuts straight through Russia's propaganda. Closest to the Kremlin no longer trust it. Why should anyone else? Narrative shift that no state can afford, least of all one already facing international backlash and tightening sanctions, is not driven by a single event, but by accumulated experiences, years of political pressure, economic maneuvers, border disputes, Moscow to reassert control. Soviet allies turn. The ultimate betrayal. Former allies watched what happened in Crimea, Georgia, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Balkans. They watched how Russia punished nations that tried to pivot westward. They watched how Moscow dismissed their sovereignty when convenient. Memories have not faded. They have crystallized into caution, and now that caution has become action as these states turn westward. The ripple effect is enormous. Their alliances shift. Their military cooperation agreements expand, and their public sentiment changes. Their media landscapes move away from Russian influence. Their economies begin integrating with Western institutions, and slowly, one by one, the one pillars that once connected them to Moscow crumble. This is where the hook tightens even more. Russia isn't losing partners because they lack options. It's losing them because they finally have better ones. What Russia once perceived as loyalty was largely survival. But today the global environment has changed. See strength in collective Western alignment. They see economic stability without Russian dominance, safety without Kremlin interference, and most importantly, they see the cost of staying tied to Moscow rising faster than the benefits. The Kremlin, this shift triggers a very specific type of fear. Authoritarian systems rely on the illusion of unbreakable influence. When that illusion shatters something, a dangerous weakness, and weakness invites further separation. Russia understands that once a former ally steps away publicly, others start questioning whether they should be the next to leave. That is the danger Moscow faces now. not a military threat unraveling of a sphere of influence it spent decades trying to maintain. This is the silent betrayal the Kremlin never thought possible, yet cannot stop. Once echoed Moscow's talking points, now rewrite their alliances without hesitation, and in doing so, Russia cannot escape. A power that cannot keep its closest neighbors cannot claim to lead a region, let alone a world. The United States closing every remaining exit option for Russia is not simply a diplomatic maneuver. It is a strategic chokehold that signals a historic shift in global power dynamics, has moved beyond symbolic sanctions or verbal warnings, has engaged in a level of coordinated pressure that leaves Moscow with virtually no escape routes, no fallback positions, pathways to maneuver around the consequences of its own actions. And here's the hook that makes this moment so defining: the US isn't just responding to Russia, it's containing it. That distinction matters because containment is not temporary, containment is structural, becomes the new architecture of global order. This escalation didn't happen in isolation. It came after months of intelligence briefings, closed-door meetings, and quiet diplomatic alignment with European allies. But once the decision was made, the US acted with a level of speed and precision that Moscow was not prepared for. Or air corridors were shut, maritime lanes were restricted, back channels were sealed. Even neutral states under US influence began closing ports, refusing overflight permission, halting cargo transfers. Russian diplomatic movement. In the span of days, Russia found itself boxed in not by geography, but by international consensus, one that Washington orchestrated with surgical accuracy. For Russia, exit routes are not just pathways. They are lifelines. They are how Moscow moves resources, negotiates influence, and maintains leverage. When those exits close, the Kremlin loses the ability to pivot. It loses the ability to bluff. It loses the ability to claim that global pressure is fragmented. The US made sure that pressure is not only unified but absolute. That's why this moment hits harder than sanctions ever could. When a nation has nowhere left to turn, it must confront the consequences of its own isolation. The strategic brilliance from Washington's perspective lies in the timing. The US waited until Europe had already sealed land and diplomatic channels. Soviet allies began distancing themselves and then delivered U.S. shuts all exits, total containment the final blow, the closing of all remaining exits. It was not a reaction, final phase of a long calculated strategy. The Kremlin may have expected tension, expected condemnation, even expected economic pushback. The complete shutdown of available escape routes is something Russia had not foreseen at this scale. This is why the Kremlin's response has been chaotic and defensive. They are reacting from a position of entrapment, not strength. And here is where the hook tightens even further. The United States did not act alone. Washington brought with it the weight of NATO's infrastructure, the intelligence capabilities of multiple allies, and the diplomatic reach of nearly every major Western institution. This is not the US isolating Russia. This is the US leading the world in isolating Russia that historically avoided taking sides. Were quietly convinced or pressured to join the effort, directly cooperate, were still influenced by economic ties, security partnerships, or geopolitical realities shaped by American positioning, it has also triggered a psychological shift inside Russia's leadership circle. The Kremlin is accustomed to being sanctioned, accustomed to diplomatic tension, but it is not accustomed to being cornered. As Moscow faced a situation where its movements are monitored, restricted, and countered at every turn, of containment forces Russia to operate within a shrinking box, one that gets smaller with every miscalculation. And in politics, cornered power is far more dangerous than an openly aggressive one. The US understands this. Washington's move is not about punishment. It is about control or exits. The United States has effectively set the boundaries of Russia's future behavior. Whether Moscow escalates or retreats, so inside a framework the US helped design, and that is the most powerful shift of all. Here is the real takeaway. Largest superpower decides that a nation should have no way out. That nation enters a geopolitical winter from which it cannot emerge unchanged. Russia is now stepping into that winter with no doors left to open. Isolation today is not just unprecedented. It is destabilizing in ways the Kremlin never imagined possible. For decades, operated with the belief that no matter how strained relations became, it would always maintain a circle of influence large enough to protect its interests, its history, its energy supplies, and its military presence guaranteed relevance. But that era is over, isolated than at any point since the end of the Cold War and the hook. The part that stings the most is this. The world is no longer waiting for Russia to rejoin it. The world is moving on without Russia entirely. Isolation at this scale is not merely diplomatic. It affects every layer of Russia's stat, its economy, its alliances, its trade routes, its military projections, its cultural presence, global decision-making. What makes this moment so striking is that the isolation wasn't caused by a single event. It was built step by step, a series of decisions Russia believed it could absorb, but each miscalculation chipped away at its standing. Now the full cost has arrived, and the Kremlin is discovering that isolation is not a punishment. It's a position, a permanent one, if the world chooses to make it so. Makes this isolation so severe is the sudden absence of reliable partners. Even when Russia clashed with the West, fallback states, countries' economic and political consequences for Russia willing to do business quietly aligned militarily or at least refuse to condemn Moscow's actions. This is disappearing. Nations that once depended on Russia economically are now diversifying. Countries that relied on Russian gas are turning to alternative suppliers that once abstained in global votes are beginning to shift toward Western consensus. And here's the sharp hook. Stop fearing your power and start doubting your stability. Your influence evaporates faster than your military can rebuild it. Consequences are equally devastating. Sanctions cut deep. But what cuts deeper is the loss of trust from global financial institutions. Investment dries up. International firms exit. Currency stability trembles. Trade deals are suspended or rewritten without Russia at the table. Moscow isn't just excluded, it's becoming irrelevant to major global markets. Excluded from the world's economic bloodstream cannot sustain long-term power, no matter how much political bravado it projects. Isolation also creates a strategic vulnerability. Russia is not accustomed to confronting without allies to balance against Western. Moscow cannot shape the narrative, cannot negotiate from strength, and cannot rally support for its positions. Its influence in Europe has collapsed. Leverage in Central Asia is weakening. Its relationships in the Middle East, once dependable, are becoming transactional rather than strategic. Moscow's most important partner is cooperating on its own terms with no intention of being Russia's savior. That is the quiet part of the story. Truth, the Kremlin does not say aloud. China is not Russia's ally. It is Russia's option, and only for as long as it benefits China. Internally, isolation creates a pressure cooker. Public sentiment becomes harder to control. Economic hardships grow more visible. Factions begin questioning strategy. Authoritarian systems rely on the illusion of external strength to maintain internal order. Cracks when the world closes its doors and leaves a nation standing alone. Domestic challenges intensify. The Kremlin knows this. responds to isolation with aggression, rhetoric, and escalating demand. It is not strength, it is fear. Once people realize how alone Russia truly is, they will begin to question everything, and that brings us to the core of this moment. Russia is not simply left out, it is being shut out. The world is building systems, alliances, trade routes, frameworks that do not include Moscow at all. This is the irreversible part. The hook that will define the next decade is no longer a consequence of Russia's actions. It is becoming the global default. When a country reaches that level of exclusion, narrows to a point where every misstep becomes existential. This is the crossroads at which Russia now stands alone. Constrained world that no longer depends on it, no longer fears it, and increasingly no longer needs it. Dangerous threat right now is not an army on its borders, not sanctions tightening around its economy, the political alliances forming against it. The real danger, the one the Kremlin cannot bomb, intimidate, or negotiate away, is the collapse of trust. Trust is the invisible architecture of global power. It is what allows nations to form alliances, negotiate deals, maintain influence long after their military strength fades. And for Russia, that architecture is breaking faster than it can repair it. Hook that makes this moment so explosive once trust collapses returns the same way. And Russia is discovering that the world no longer sees it as dependable, predictable, or stable. For years, relied on relationships built not on genuine trust, but on fear, convenience, and transactional interests. Allies cooperated because they needed Russian gas, aligned because they feared Moscow's retaliation. Neighboring states remained quiet because they believed Russia could still shift the balance of power in a heartbeat. But today, none of those calculations are holding. A nation cannot maintain influence when the people around it no longer believe in its promises or fear its power. Shaking under the Kremlin right now, countries' strategic implications for Europe and NATO that once calibrated their policies around Russian reaction simply aren't doing that anymore. Moving independently, confidently, and in some cases defiantly, trust collapses quietly at first with doubts. Nations questioning whether Moscow will uphold its commitments, keep its word, or maintain stability. Then it turns into hesitation, partners delaying agreements, avoiding long-term deals, or reconsidering security arrangements. And finally, open disconnection, where countries no longer rely on Russia at all. That is where the world is now, and the hook that intensifies the moment is this becomes unreliable. It loses influence faster than any sanction can strip it away. The erosion of trust is happening on multiple fronts simultaneously. In diplomacy, Russia's promises carry less weight. In trade are viewed with suspicion. In security, its threats no longer deter but provoke. Even in regions where Russia once wielded dominance, Central Asia, Eastern Europe, leaders now question whether aligning with Moscow brings any benefit at all. Played balancing games between Russia and the West are no longer afraid to lean decisively toward the West. Leverage is evaporating because influence without trust is an empty shell. This collapse also carries internal consequences that Russia cannot escape. External, it is internal. When citizens lose trust in economic stability, markets react. When elites lose trust in leadership, factions form. When military families lose trust in the future, morale fractures. Faces external distrust while also confronting internal uncertainty, enters a zone of instability that no government can fully control. Volatility is beginning to surface inside the Kremlin's decision-making circles. In the hesitations, the contradictions, missingly aggressive rhetoric meant to mask insecurity, and the hook deepens here. Russia cannot rebuild trust while acting from desperation. Every escalation creates more doubt. Every unpredictable move reinforces the world's belief that Moscow is unstable. Every broken agreement becomes another warning to partners that Russia cannot be relied upon. Trust thrives in consistency. Russia is offering only unpredictability. What amplifies this crisis is the global response. Nations are not simply stepping back, they are replacing Russia. New energy suppliers, new trade partners, new security alliances, new diplomatic coalitions are taking shape without Moscow. The world is reorganizing, and Russia is not part of the blueprint. The collapse of trust becomes truly irreparable when the world builds new systems that do not require US signals that your relevance has already diminished. Russia's leadership understands this, and that awareness is creating an atmosphere of quiet panic. Stop trusting you, they stop investing in you. When they stop investing in you, they stop depending on you, no longer depends on you. Militarily, economically, or politically, your power does not just shrink. It disappears. Rus is now a danger far more devastating than any battlefield loss. Because once trust collapses, the world doesn't rebuild the bridge, walks away. Russia being cornered by Europe's sealed bridges and the US all remaining exits has pushed the Kremlin into the most unpredictable and dangerous phase of modern geopolitics. A nation with Russia's history does not respond calmly to global reactions. Allies, neutrals, and enemies feeling trapped. And this is where the hook hits hardest. Power is the most volatile power, and Russia now finds itself backed into a geopolitical corner with no clean path forward. Inside the international community isn't just about what Moscow will do next, but about how desperation may shape its decisions. When a country still believes it has room to maneuver, it makes calculated moves. It weighs consequences, negotiates alternatives, and uses diplomacy as a tool. But when that country loses all exit options, calculations turn into impulses. The Kremlin is navigating a shrinking map, one where every road ends in pressure, ends in uncertainty, and every strategy ends in containment. This is not the posture of a confident state confronting the terrifying reality that its old methods no longer work, is that Russia's leadership has built its identity around strength, dominance, and the projection of power. Admitting weakness is impossible. Accepting limitations is unthinkable. So when the world corners Russia, the Kremlin reacts not with restraint but with escalation. Military threats, maneuvers, cyber operations, economic sabotage, and disinformation campaigns. These are not strategies of power, they are strategies of survival. Intensifies here a nation that fears it is losing everything is the most likely to risk anything. Behind the scenes, Gen's agencies across the world are increasingly alarmed. Their concern isn't driven by Russia's strength. It's driven by Russia's desperation. Analysts understand that the pressure on Moscow is not just external, it is internal. The Kremlin faces political instability, economic downturn, elite fractures, public frustration. A cornered government facing both inward and outward pressure begins to view every challenge as existential, stops distinguishing between threats. It reacts to criticism the same way it reacts to encirclement with force. But the more impulsive Russia becomes, isolated it becomes, and the more isolated it becomes, the more impulsive it becomes. Again, this is the cycle world leaders are watching with deep unease. Now operating inside a tightening loop of pressure and reaction, a loop that could produce sudden military escalations, border provocations, reckless diplomatic confrontations. These actions are not signs of confidence. They are the reflexes of a state trying to break out of a corner. It did not believe it would ever find itself in later of danger emerges from Russia's fading alliances. Without strong partners to support or restrain it, Moscow's decisions lack the moderating influence that alliances often provide. China may engage economically, but it will not intervene politically to save Russia. Soviet allies are distancing themselves. Europe has shut its doors. What's next for the Kremlin? The US is enforcing a tight containment strategy. Russia is essentially alone. It can no longer influence. And loneliness is dangerous for a nation built on the belief that it is surrounded by enemies. A country feels alone. It does not look outward for cooperation. It looks inward for justification and outward for targets. Inside the Kremlin, this pressure is producing contradictory behavior, aggressive rhetoric mixed with sudden proposals for talks, harsh military threats paired with diplomatic overtures, public defiance masking private uncertainty. These contradictions are not random, reflect a leadership searching for a way out of a corner that has already closed behind them. The hook here is this: when a power cannot find an exit, tries to create one, no matter the cost. Community understands that the next phase of Russia's behavior will not be shaped by strategy, but by pressure. A cornered Russia is a Russia that might lash out simply to prove it still can. It might test boundaries, provoke crisis, destabilize regions to force the world to acknowledge its relevance. These moves are not signs of strength. They are signals of fear. Driven actions can be just as devastating as calculated ones, sometimes even more so. This is the reality the world must confront. Russia is standing at a point of maximum pressure and minimum options. The choices it makes from this corner, impulsive, defensive, could reshape global stability. And the question that hangs over every capital right now is chilling. What does a desperate Russia closing thoughts and takeaways do next? Closing in, and every exit has been sealed. So here we are witnessing a turning point that will be remembered for decades, has severed the bridges. Washington has locked the exits, and Moscow is standing at the center, by the silence of former allies who have finally walked away. History tells us that isolation is the beginning of the end for every empire that overreaches. The question now is not whether Russia. The question is what Moscow will do next, and how the world will respond when it does. And that, as always, we will continue to follow, because tonight is not the end of the chapter. It is the beginning of a very long, very uncertain. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for more updates on the Russian-Ukraine war and other global developments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, stay informed and stay safe.